Hi, I'm Rob Stryker with Red Hat Developer, and today I'll be showing you the Server Connector extension for VSCode. The Server Connector extension for VSCode is a tool for your development environment to help you publish projects or deploy them to local or possibly in the future remote runtime or server instances. For example, if you're trying to make a web archive project and you want to deploy it to a Wildfly or a JBoss EAP, or potentially if you want to make an OSGI bundle and deploy it to an Apache Felix instance. Well, right now the Server Connector only provides support for a few specific runtimes, which I'll list in a little bit. It's a very extensible framework, and the UI and the core are both able to be built on top of in order to provide support for more runtime and server combinations from other companies or just free open source ones. Before we dive into the features of the Server Connector and how it can help you in your development environment, we're just going to take a quick step back and discuss where the idea for it came from and how it's designed. And we're going to do this by talking about something called language servers. In the past, if you wanted to add support for a new language, and what I mean by support is code completion, pre-compilation, recognizing errors in the code, recognizing syntax errors. If you had a new programming language that was picking up mindshare and you needed to make support for it in all the different IDEs, you'd have to go and make a custom extension for each one of those IDEs in order to gain support for your language. This is obviously a lot of work. Each language might need to have their support written multiple times, possibly in different languages. You have to duplicate a lot of work to do that. The amount of work explodes even more if you account for multiple languages. So the idea behind language servers was that if they separate this out into a standalone process that talks to each other over a socket and sends information back and forth, things like code completion, pre-compilation, syntax errors could be written once as a standalone process. And then all you need to do is you have to make sure each editor supports language servers in general, but not each specific language. And in that way, if your editor supports language servers, then it now supports every language server that one has been written for. So the central development here is that by breaking each language server out into its own process, you remove a lot of duplication. Now each editor only needs to support language servers, not each specific language. And then for asking for errors, pre-compilation, syntax, it can just query your language server, which is running as a standalone process. The same idea is what's driving the Server Connector and the underlying RSP, the Runtime Server Protocol. If we want to create support for our application server, whether that's Tomcat, JBoss Wildfly, Red Hat EAP, or even something smaller like an OSGI bundle container like Apache Felix or Fuse Carafe, instead of having to make this support multiple times for each editor, possibly in different languages, you can break that out into a standalone process. And that standalone process can be reused. If an editor could support Runtime Server Protocol, then it can support all the servers that exist that have support for Runtime Server Protocol. Basically, it reduces the work a lot. With all that in mind, we can now begin to look at the Server Connector extension and what functionality it has. It turns out the Server Connector extension is actually two extensions. The one that you see probably here is the Server Connector by Red Hat, which is allowing you to start, stop, publish to, and control Red Hat runtime products like Wildfly, EAP, CDK, and Minishift. But behind it is another extension. This one's called RSPUI. The RSPUI extension controls the server's view, what actions and context menus can show up, and how to talk to any RSP. The Server Connector extension only really provides that standalone process that we're going to talk to, and you can start that process and stop it. Now that we've installed these two extensions, you can see here that only that one RSP provider is listed in the server's view. If you want to turn that off, if you don't want to interface with your servers, and if you want that process to go away for now, you can stop the RSP provider. And if it's being fidgety and doesn't want to stop, you can terminate it. Once it's stopped, that process is dead. You're no longer talking to it. You can't control any servers. This is good if you want to slim down your development environment and turn off some features. But if you do want to start talking to your servers again, you just right-click on your provider and say Start the RSP provider. Like I said, here we're starting the RSP server provider. This is the Red Hat RSP server, and it allows us to talk to Wildfly, EAP, and other Red Hat products. The next step is to create a new server. You're going to tell it, hey, what kind of servers do you provide, and can I create one? There are two ways to create a server, and we're going to take them one at a time. The first one is, if you look here, it'll ask you, do you want to download a server? If you already have a server on your disk, you've already installed Wildfly or EAP somewhere on your system, you're going to say no. But if you don't have one and you want to get one, you're going to say yes. We'll address the downloading the server workflow a little bit later, but for now, let's just use one on our disk. So here we'll select no, we're going to use a server on our disk, and it will give us a chance to browse to that system file somewhere on our disk. Now that I've selected the server home location that we're going to tell the RSP server we want to create a server out of, it asks us for a server name. Since we're creating a Wildfly 17, we'll just name it Wildfly 17. When creating a server, each server type might have a list of required attributes for you to fill out and a list of optional attributes for you to fill out. Right now we're creating a Red Hat server, and it doesn't seem to have too many required attributes other than what the server home is, which we've already addressed. It then asks us if we want to edit some optional parameters. I'm going to say yes just so you can see what kind of options are available for Red Hat servers, for Wildfly and EAP. But this list of optional attributes might be completely different and is completely different for CDK, Minishift, and probably other server types. So I'll just go through them so you can see what options are here, but this list sometimes gets added to, sometimes gets removed from, as we add or decrease support for various features. The first one it might ask us for is if we want to override our Java home. If you don't want to override your Java home, then when you start your Wildfly or EAP, it'll use your default system Java. But if you wanted to use a specific Java that you have somewhere on your disk, you would override this version. Since we don't want to do that, we're just going to press enter here. You can enable or disable an auto publisher. This is an interesting feature where if you've deployed a project, it'll watch your project for changes and try to deploy those changes in hot deploy. Right now we're going to leave that enabled. If you do have your auto publisher enabled, you can set how long it runs, every 5 seconds or every 10 seconds. You might want to customize this, and I'll show you how to edit settings later, but for now we'll leave it at the default. There are other options, like you can change the bind port. Basically, a bunch of these settings allow you to override your launch arguments in order to customize how you want to start your server. Not all server types will have these many options or allow you this much control over starting or stopping them, but the Wildfly and EAP ones try to give you a little bit more control. Once you've created your server, you can see it show up here, and if you look at the context menu, we have quite a bit of options. We can start it in debug mode, we can delete it, we can add deployments to it, we can publish, we can look at their output channels, and we can run specific server actions. We'll address these one by one. The next thing to look at is starting and stopping your server. This is probably the most basic thing you'll want to do in your development environment after deploying things to it. So let's first start our Wildfly server. When you start it in normal mode, it's just going to launch a Java process and it's going to copy the output into your output channel. This is very convenient. You don't have to go to a terminal to find a way to launch your Wildfly instance or your EAP instance. In this way, you just use the UI and your server starts up. As you can see, the output is showing that the server is now completely started. If we try to stop the server, we can see what happens here. You'll see a little bit more output, and then you'll see that the server is stopping. What's actually going on behind the scenes here is that the extension is talking to the process, the standalone process, and sending a simple JSON request that says, hey, please stop server wildfly17. Each RSP can have multiple servers in it, but right now we only have one. If you wanted, you could create other ones, like wildfly15, EAP, and a bunch of other options. Now that we've created a server through the standard method of using one on disk, I should at least show you what it looks like when you want to download another one that you don't have on disk. So here we'll go to Create New Server, and we'll say yes, we would like to download a server. Now here's the important part. Each RSP might have very different methods for you to download their servers. For example, if you want to download JBoss 4.2 or JBoss 6, it's quite easy. You basically just agree to the license, click OK, say you agree, and it begins downloading. It'll download pretty quick because JBoss 4 wasn't that big. But if you want to install something else, something newer, or something more restricted like EAP or CDK, you might have much larger workflow to go through. Now that you see that we've created JBoss 4.2, you can edit it, you can do all the things that you can with other servers. Now let's show a more complicated workflow. If you want to download EAP or CDK, one of our more restricted ones that require license agreements, you can click on it, and it will ask you to provide a secure storage password. Since we need to execute a remote command and download the runtime, and we need a password to do it, we need to make sure that if we store that password, we store it encrypted. It's going to ask me for my Red Hat credentials. At that point, I can type them in, and we'll see what happens. If you don't have a Red Hat account, it might prompt you to make one or link you to a web browser where you have to make one. But I already have an account, and so it really just asks me to agree to the license, and then it downloads the EAP. If you didn't have an account, it would ask for a few extra steps, or it might direct you to an external web browser. Now you can see that the JBoss EAP runtime has been downloaded. Next, we're going to look at editing your server. The RSP, or at least our version of an RSP, keeps the server objects, the things that represent your wildfly17, with all your settings and optional and required attributes, in a text file somewhere on your disk, in a private directory. But you can see what that file looks like by right-clicking on your server and going Edit Server. Each server type might have a completely different set of options here. You can see many of these reference Wildfly or JBoss, and you can see that some of them are kind of more general. For example, server auto-publishing, you can turn on or off. What you'll see here, though, is that some of these can be changed and some of these can't. You don't really know which ones can't be changed until after you try to save the file. For example, if you try to change this to false and save the file, it'll come and tell you that that field may not be changed. So you undo your change and you save it again. You can change some things. You can't change your ID, but you can change, for example, auto-publish, and you can turn it off. See, now you see that Wildfly server has saved correctly. Now your auto-publisher is not enabled, so if you had deployments, they're now not going to be auto-published. You'll have to publish them manually. But let's leave it on for now. But other things like your port, your configuration file, and maybe even your program arguments can be changed. The steps to overriding your program arguments would be to set your args override to true, and then coming in and modifying this long list of configuration details. Care should be taken when you change these settings, though, because sometimes we prefer to build your arguments out of the existing settings. If you don't override your arguments, and if this value is false, then when you start your server, we prefer to generate the program arguments out of your settings, like your server config file, your server host, and your port. We'll use these to generate the values that should be used for your program arguments and your VM arguments. But if you really want to take control of your settings, you can override your settings and set this to true, and then override your launch arguments. Take care to remember to escape your quotes so that when it's sent to the remote system, when it's sent to your RSP, it uses the proper set of launch arguments and doesn't get messed up by missing quotes or strings. Now that we've seen how to edit our server attributes, and remember each server exposes different attributes, they're all custom for your server type, we can go and look at some of the other items in the context menu. The first one I want to show is server actions. Again, each server type might have completely different actions. Something like Wildfly might allow you to do some things, but Minishift and CDK will have very different actions exposed. So in this way, each server type can customize their experience and their shortcuts for their users. If we go to server action, we'll see that the Wildfly 17 version exposes two actions. One of them is show in web browser, the other is edit your configuration file. Since our server stopped right now, let's just edit the configuration file. What you can see here is that you can now edit your standalone XML or whichever configuration file you've selected in your settings. You can change whatever you want here, but be careful because if you change too much, you might need to adjust your server launch arguments, program arguments, and VM arguments in order to match exactly what you want. Either way, you should be okay, but just try to make sure that you're keeping these two items in sync and that you're starting the server with the flags that you really want them to. If we want to see the next action, though, we should start the server first. The next action that was exposed, it says show in web browser. And obviously we can't show either a deployment or the website's or the application server's welcome page without first starting the server. Now that it's started, we can right click on it and we can go to server actions and select show in browser. At that point it's going to ask us which deployment we want to see, and since we don't have any deployments yet, we're just going to select the welcome page. The welcome page showed up over here in a web browser window. What basically happened here is our RSP told the editor, hey, please try to show this web page. And since this editor doesn't have a built-in web browser, it launched it through the external web browser. If you were in something like Eclipse, and if Eclipse had support for the Runtime server protocol, it might open it in the internal browser inside your Eclipse version. But VSCode doesn't have this feature, and so it launches it through an external window. The next thing to demonstrate is deployments. Being able to start and stop your server is certainly handy and helps you out a little bit, but if you can't publish your project to it, it's not really all that useful. We'll start by right-clicking on our server and selecting Add Deployment to Server. The first thing it's going to ask you is whether it's a file or an exploded deployment. We'll try both of them, but for now we're just going to try the file deployment so you can see how it works. If you come down to your file deployment and you browse for a directory where you have a file deployment, like a sample WAR file, you can see it about to be deployed. But it asks you an additional question. Do you want to edit any additional optional parameters? A lot of people are tempted to say no right away, but the first time you should probably click yes just to see what optional parameters this server exposes for you. This one allows you to customize the output name, including your extension. For example, sample.war. This is important because if you've chosen a file that is a WAR file but maybe has a different extension, you might want to change that. If you've chosen a folder with no extension, maybe it's the output of a build command, maybe in a target folder, you might want to change the name of that folder when you deploy it. In this case, we're going to leave it the same, so we're just going to press enter. And then we'll see that the file's been deployed. First it shows up here, and you can see the view says that a full publish was required. But then, once it copied it over, it said we've been synchronized. And it starts to show some output here that indicates the file's been copied. Since that's a WAR file, I can't really do too much in order to change it. But I think I can bring my terminal over here and we can touch the file and see if it recognizes a change. you can see immediately that a publish is required. The auto-publisher recognized that this file is changed and that it needed to be redeployed. If you didn't want that behavior, you could turn your auto-publisher off. But in the way it's currently configured, any change is going to be copied over within 5 seconds. Now that we've seen how to do file deployments, let's remove it from the server and see what happens. Now it says there's a full publish required because we're attempting to remove it. And then finally the publish request goes through, the file is removed, and you can see it was undeployed. Let's try adding an exploded deployment now so you can see if there's any difference. We can add a deployment to the server. We'll go exploded. And we can go to our folder where we have it. And we'll select that folder. It asks us, do we want to edit the optional parameters? Since we're okay with it being named sample.war, we're not going to change the parameters this time. But you might want to pay attention to that in the future. We see a full publish is required. We see there's a change. It's now published. And now we wait for the server to recognize it, which it does. Now that we've seen it's been deployed, we might want to see how it looks in the web browser. We can go to Show in Browser, and we can select the sample WAR file. And we'll see that it loads up just like this. So this is the page that we just deployed. We can see it's there. But what if we want to modify that file? This appears to be an index.html. So if we edit that file, and we see it says sample hello world, we can change that to RSP hello world, and we'll change the H1 here too for better visibility. When we save this file, we're going to see that the server becomes publish required. And then shortly after that, we're going to see that it's synchronized. The server might not show any output because we're just changing an HTML file. But if we come over here and show in browser again, we're going to see that the RSP has been updated. This might only work for static files. The details of incremental deployment will be heavily dependent on what server type you're using, what the server itself supports, and what the tooling for it also supports. Right now we try our best to support static files and even class files, but only if you have a remote debugger enabled. We'll look into that next. Now, just to show you what happens if you have a folder that needs to have its name changed, I figured we'd run through this because a couple of users have run into this error. So first we're going to remove what deployments we already have there. And we're going to wait for the server to synchronize itself. But after that, we're going to try to add a deployment to the server. And it's going to be a folder with a bad name. If we come over to my temp directory, and we go into sample, and we can pick sample2. Now what happens if you deploy a folder as an exploded WAR just named sample2 to a Wildfly application server? It's the exact same folder as the sample.war is, the exact same structure. But if we select it, and we don't change any of the optional parameters, you'll see what happens. The server doesn't like it. The server says we can't deploy that without using an appropriate suffix. If we did try to have it deployed, it still might not work. The server would recognize it's a folder and would try to look into it. So we've tried to protect you from that. So how do you deploy it? What you have to do is you have to add a deployment to the server, go to Exploded, browse your sample folder, and then modify your optional parameters. Do you want to edit the optional parameters? Yes, we do. And we'd like to change the deployment name to sample2.war. Now when we try to deploy it, the server should recognize it and know that it's sample2.war and it's been deployed. And there it has. Now if we try to show it in a web browser, it shows up at the sample2 URL. This is why it's important to make sure you know what you're deploying. The server, if we don't set an optional name override, it'll just copy it into the deployment directory as a folder named sample2. And the Wildfly application server won't like that at all. It expects them to have extensions. So we should do our best to give them what they need. Finally, for deployments, we have just a few more settings. Obviously, we can remove a deployment that we no longer want, and we'll do that toward the end. But for now, if your server is not behaving properly, or if you've turned off your automatic publishing, you can either force your server to publish incremental. What that means is your server will do its best to go through and locate any changed files that it has to copy over into the deployment directory. Or if you're concerned about old files that haven't been deleted, which shouldn't happen, but sometimes can, you can execute a full publish, which means it'll wipe out that folder in the deployment directory and then copy over all new artifacts. When you do a full publish, the server knows to scan it and will recognize that it's a new deployment. And here you can see that it's replaced the deployment. Finally, you can remove your deployment and watch as it gets removed from the server's deployment folder. Once the full publish is executed, that folder will be removed, it'll be undeployed, and you now no longer have a problem. Before we finish up here today, I'd like to demo just one more thing. It's a bit of a more complicated use case, but I think it kind of brings everything together. It's going to involve running our server in debug mode, and then using a larger Maven project and debugging into it. Before we do it though, you have to install some more extensions. So what I've installed was Maven for Java. This allows you to run your Maven build on your Maven project, the debugger for Java, which is important, and the language support for Java. Since we're running a Java web app here and we're going to try to deploy it to a Java application server, we kind of need all of the Java utilities that they provide. What we do now is if we look at our project, we'll see that there's a bunch of code and then a target folder for the Maven build. And inside the target folder is a folder called Kitchen Sink, which is basically the packaged up Maven project, except it's exploded. This is the folder we want to use, so we're going to copy it as a path because this is the one we're going to want to deploy to our server. First thing we'll do is we'll come over and we'll start our server in debug mode. The server is going to take a slightly longer to start up in debug mode, but for the most part it's pretty fast. Once that happens though, we're going to come back to our server and we're going to try to add a deployment. So we add our deployment, and we're going to say it's an exploded deployment, and we're going to go to our kitchen sink target kitchen sink folder. This is where everything gets built and where all of your classes are compiled into. We're going to select that exploded folder, but since that folder was named kitchen sink and the web server is going to expect an extension, we have to override the deployment name and make it kitchen sink.war. Once it's here, you'll see that it'll get published. Since it's a bit of a larger project and requires a few more services from Wildfly, it might take a little bit longer than our sample war from before, but it really won't take that long at all. Once it's running, what we can do is we can right-click on our server actions and we can show this in our web browser. And what we see here, excuse the language, is an application which basically has a list of members and you can register yourself on the list. So as an example, we can first add someone named RSP Rocks and we'll give him a phone number. When we click register, we should expect a breakpoint to be hit if we've set one. And so what I've done is I've set a breakpoint here so that we can hit it. When I register, our breakpoint is hit, and you can see that there is some output representing what the code currently is. If we want to change that code though, we can make a change right now, save the file, and watch as it gets deployed, and then come back here and try again. And now what we can see is that the code was hot code replaced. It was replaced immediately, and now as we go through the sysout, it now shows the new text. We can change that again just in case you don't believe me. And we'll save it again, and we'll come back in and add a third one. And now we can see it was changed again to RSP rocks now. So hot code replace does work, but if you try to change the code now while your breakpoint is inside the method, it might fail. This isn't a restriction on the RSP server, but this is a restriction based on the Java tools that we just installed at the beginning of this tutorial. It's not our fault if the Java debugger can't figure out how to hot code replace when it's already inside of a method. But I think that they'll improve that in the future. You can see an error like that if you try to do it now and you try to add this in as we speak. See, now you can see that there's a message that says the hot code replace failed because there are obsolete methods on the stack. So there are some limitations with the Java debugger that is used inside VSCode, but for the most part, it really does work and allow you to make hot code replace changes, just not while you're already executing in the method that you'd want. With that, we can close down our application, remove the deployment from the server, execute a full publish. Once that's done, we can stop the server and end our tutorial. Thank you for coming and watching this video today. I hope you guys find some use for it. We do plan to eventually add more runtimes like Carafe, Fuse, and maybe Tomcat, depending on community feedback and if this is a useful utility for people trying to use it. We think it's a really cool idea. We've had similar success when we made Eclipse tooling that did fairly similar behavior. And we think that it's something that every IDE should pretty much have because people deploy and publish to runtimes and applications all the time. So if this is something that you feel can help you out, feel free to use it. Links to the GitHub pages and feedback channels will be provided along with this video. So thank you for your time. I hope this was useful for you. Have a good day.